Today I'd like to talk about Richard E. Meyer and his cognitive theory of multimedia learning, CTML, one of the most influential theories in educational technology. Focus is not simply whether technology helps learning, but how learning experiences should be designed. Who Richard Meyer is, foundations of CTML, applications to online learning and instructional design, why this theory is relevant in today's AI-driven educational environments is what I want to show you today. Personally, I've been designing online courses for nearly 10 years. As I studied CTML, I realized many of the instructional designs I had been making through experience were actually supported by decades of cognitive research. For me, Meyer's work makes the connection between educational theory with the practical decisions we make every day when we design learning experiences. Richard Meyer is one of the leading researchers in educational psychology and instructional design, professor emeritus at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dedicated much of his career to understand how people learn, especially in multimedia environments. One thing I appreciate about his work is that he didn't ask, does technology improve learning? Instead, he asked, how should we design instruction so technology actually supports learning? His research combines cognitive psychology with instructional design. Developed the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, or CTML. His principles are based on decades of empirical research, not educational trends or assumptions. He influences from online courses, instructional videos, e-learning, all the way to the design of AI-supported learning experiences. To better understand why his work has had such a lasting impact, let's look at how CTML developed over time. One thing I find interesting about CTML is that it didn't appear overnight. Meyer built on the work of other researchers rather than starting from scratch. Two important influences were Alan Paibio's dual coding theory and John Sweller's cognitive load theory. During the 90s, Meyer began asking an important question: how do words and pictures work together to improve learning? After years of research and experimentation, he published Multimedia Learning in 2001, introducing CTML. Since then, the theory has continued to evolve. Today, it guides the design of online courses all the way to AI-supported learning environments. One idea I think is especially important is that Meyer never tried to prove technology was good for learning. His real question was, how can we design instruction so technology supports the way people naturally learn? I believe that's one of the reasons his work is still so relevant today, especially as we continue integrating AI into education. Now that we've seen how theory developed, let's look at the three assumptions that serve as the foundation of CTML. CTML is built around three simple but powerful assumptions about how people learn. Once we understand these, the rest of Meyer's principles make much more sense. Dual channel assumption. We process information through separate channels, one for visual information and another for verbal information. Good instructional design takes advantage of both channels instead of relying on only one. Limited capacity assumption is the second assumption, reminding us that working memory has limits. We can only process so much information at one time. And that is why slides filled with text, distracting graphics, or too much information can actually reduce learning instead of improving it. Sometimes less really is more. Active processing assumption. Finally, learning isn't passive. The students don't learn simply by watching a video or reading a chapter. They need to actively select information, organize it, and connect it with what they already know. That's where activities, discussions, reflections, and practice become so important. As online instructors, this slide really should resonate because it enforces something I haven't experienced over the years. The goal isn't to include more content or more technology. It's to design learning experiences that help students process information without overwhelming them. These three assumptions became the foundation for the multimedia principles Meyer developed. Let's look at that next. Major principles of multimedia learning actually are based on these three assumptions we just went through. Meyer developed several instructional principles that educators can immediately apply when designing learning experiences. One of the best known is the multimedia principle, which tells us that students learn better when words and visuals work together, rather than relying on text alone. Another one is coherence. The idea is simple. Remove anything that doesn't contribute to learning. Decorative images, background music, or unnecessary animations may look appealing, but they can actually distract students. The segmenting principle encourages to break complex content into smaller, manageable pieces instead of presenting everything at once. And finally, the signaling principle reminds us to guide students' attention into using headings, color, arrows, or the other visual cues so they know what is important. As an online instructor, these principles have had a real impact on how I design my courses. Years ago, I recorded longer lectures videos because that was the traditional approach. Today, we go with shorter videos, combine them with interactive activities, and also we give students times to pause and learn and practice. Looking back, I realized that I wasn't just changing the format of my courses, I was designing them in a way that better aligns with how people actually learn. The next slide shows that those design decisions look like when we compare them to traditional online lessons, with one that intentionally applies CTML principles. When I first started teaching online, my course looked much more like the example on the left. Longer lecture videos, text-heavy presentations, and fewer opportunities for students to interact with the material. As I learned more about instructional design, and especially after studying Meyer's work, I realized that students benefit much more when learning is broken into smaller, manageable pieces. Today, I intentionally design my lessons differently. I use short instructional videos, I use activities, I use multimedia, all that because I want my students to learn before moving forward. My goal is not to simply keep students busy. It is to keep them cognitively engaged while avoiding information overload. This slide really shows the difference between using technology to deliver content and using technology to support learning. Let's just look at CTML. How is it that improves individual lessons? It also provides guidance for designing entire online learning environments, which is what we're going to be looking at next. Supporting online teaching. One of the reasons I appreciate CTML is that it goes beyond theory and provides practical guidance for designing online courses. Whether we are organizing content in an LMS, creating instructional videos, designing self-paced modules, or building interactive activities, the question is always the same. How can I make this easier for students to learn? CTML reminds us that online learning is not about giving students more information. It is about organizing information in a way that supports how people naturally process and retain knowledge. This definitely influenced how I design my courses. I think that one of Meyer's greatest contributions, he shifted the conversation from using technology because it is available to using technology intentionally because it supports learning. This leads directly to the broader role of CTML. How is it that it plays in educational technology when instructional design becomes just as important as the tools themselves? CTML and educational technology basically captures how is it that I chose Meyer for this presentation. Today we have access to incredible technologies such as AI, learning analytics, simulation, virtual reality, adaptive learning systems. The list can go on and on. But having more technology doesn't actually lead to better learning. One lesson I learned over the years is that technology should never drive instruction. Instead, instruction should drive the choice of technology. CTML reinforces that idea by reminding us that every design decision should support how learners process information. As educators, it's easy to become excited about the newest tools. I certainly enjoy exploring new technologies and I incorporate them into my own courses. However, this theory reminds me to always ask the same questions before adopting any tool. How these improve the learning experience. If I can't clearly answer this question, then the technology probably isn't adding value. I think that's what Mayo's work remains so relevant today. Even as technology continues to evolve, the way people learn has not fundamentally changed. Good instructional design will always be at the center of effective educational learning. Now, like any influential theory, CTML has many strengths, but also has limitations. Let's look at that. Any educational theory, CTML included, has both strengths and limitations. One of its greatest strengths is that it's grounded in decades of empirical research and provides practical guidance that educators can immediately apply when designing instruction. That's one of the reasons I was drawn to this theory. It doesn't just explain how people learn. It offers concrete principles that can improve online teaching and instructional design. At the same time, CTML doesn't tell the whole story. Its primary focus is on how learners process information, but learning is influenced by much more than just cognition alone. Factors such as motivation, collaboration, social interaction, culture, and individual differences also play an important role in the learning experience. That's why I see CTML as a strong foundation rather than a complete solution. It works especially well when combined with other theories that address these other additional dimensions of learning. As educators, our goal is to find one theory that explains everything, is to understand the strengths of other perspectives and use them together to design a richer and more meaningful learning experience. As we look toward the future, these ideas become even more relevant as new technologies such as artificial intelligence and immersive learning continue to reshape education. Future of CTML. Well, this is probably my favorite part of the presentation because it connects Mayo's work with where educational technology is heading. Today, we are seeing rapid advances in artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and adaptive learning systems, and immersive learning environments. These technologies create exciting opportunities, but they are also present new challenges for educators and instructional designers. Same question continue to ask myself is not what can this technology do, but how can I use it to improve learning? That's where I think CTML becomes even more valuable. Mayo's principles remind us that regardless of how advanced technology becomes, learning still depends on how people process information. For me, that's why Mayo's work continues to be so relevant. Technology will continue to evolve, but the cognitive process behind learning remain remarkably consistent. As instruction designers, our responsibility is to make sure innovation always serves learning, not the other way around. That brings me to my final thoughts and the lasting impact of CTML. This is probably my favorite part of the presentation because it connects Mayo's work with where educational technology is heading. Today, we are seeing rapid advances in artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and other systems. These technologies create exciting opportunities, but they also represent new challenges for educators and instructional designers. One question I continue to ask myself is not what can this technology do? Again, how can I use it to improve learning? That's where I think CTML becomes important. Therefore, let's have a conclusion as we follow.